Hi, my name's Brad Eisen with Hazardscape. Are you ready to talk about continuity of support for tribal councils, health, education, nation staff, even child and family services? Because in this video, we're going to talk about how Indigenous organizations, regardless of community, if it's a private development office, a not for profit society, can ensure that during any type of disruptions, not just wildland fire, grass fire, landslide, earthquake, but also power outage, IT, any kind of disruption, an active shooter in the community, hostile person in the building, we can help you and your team reorganize your resources and your functions to respond in a way that's going to ensure that you don't interrupt your services. Meaning, if you've got payroll to meet, contracts to sign, you have caregivers to support, youth in care, it doesn't matter. We're going to help you set up a system that'll help you shuffle your teams and your resources so you can respond and then get back to normal as quickly as possible. Typically in organizations, especially if they're under-resourced or, fairly small or don't have the staff and the budget, a lot of this function can fit within its current operations. And if you've got an occupational health and safety department, or if you have an operations manager that's responsible for fleet vehicles, IT, other types of facilities that you might have, you can fit what I'm about to go over within those functions. Because it's not about starting up a big fancy new team or department. It's about taking what you have right now and at least getting started so you can assess where you are and build out a plan and a budget to help you get to where you want to be in just a couple of years. And there isn't anything complicated or magical about this. It's just having the right process, the right tools, being able to coordinate amongst different leaders and staff at your organization. If you can do that and get the information and data that you need to set out the plan, develop communications, use a framework that's right for your community, culture, or organization to get started, it doesn't take that long. If you're on our Patreon, we have a concept of operations already mapped out, which can be a starting place for any Indigenous organization. And why that framework is helpful is because it at least gives you an idea of all the things that need to be involved in a continuity of support or service program, an emergency management program. And then you can take all of that and tailor it to your culture. Because regardless of how embedded your culture and traditions are in your organization, you're still going to have elements of a colonial system, business system embedded, meaning HR, finance, operations, IT, maybe a board, executive director, directors and managers. All of that hierarchical structure exists. If you've been able to move to a more circular, holistic type of structure, that's great. But chances are that the underlying systems within your organization are still very colonial, meaning in the background, your finances, your IT, your HR systems, all of that still work. And we have a concept of operations that can help you reorganize all of that background work, maintain your culture, maintain your current organization, but help you make it become a little bit more efficient and coordinated during a very complex or chaotic disruption, like a landslide, a flood, wildfire evacuation, major power outage, if it's minus 30 degrees, whatever the case might be. So where we start working with organizations is we do what's called a resilience-based assessment. And this assessment is just a bunch of considerations and questions under 7 aspects where we try to gauge how resilient your organization is based on its current procedures, process, the staff and the roles that you have, the departments you have, the technology that you have, the partnerships, all of that has to be considered within a holistic system. So for example, if you're in child and family services, you don't just look at one aspect of a caregiver or one aspect of youth, right? You look at everything that they're involved in to sort of move along prevention, reduce harm to the youth in care or the children. And so we take the same approach at a systemic organizational level where we look at it holistically and we try to pinpoint vulnerabilities, just like you might with a youth who is doing really well. But then they get into a situation where they're hanging out with the wrong crowd, or maybe there's an evacuation that separates them from their support. And so it's about helping them become resilient by identifying when they need support, or if they're feeling a little bit more vulnerable, or to recognize a vulnerable place so they can make the right choices. We do that with organizations as well. It's really the same concept. Because if you're an organization, chances are your staff are being evacuated. So if we go with a wildland fire evacuation, and the first priority there is you have to get staff somewhere safe. It's just like that old adage when you're on an airplane, you, the adult, put on your air mask first when it drops down, and then you put on your child's. Staff of your organization have to be stable for them to deliver their services. And they're only going to be stable after they know that they're safe and that their family is safe and that they're stabilized. Then they can move on to working with the organization to make sure that they can follow through on their critical job functions. And that takes a little bit of planning. It takes some training. It takes some reorganization and coordination of the organization to make sure that everybody knows what priorities and objectives and goals are first. Because there's some things within your organization that you won't need to do for several days or weeks. We want to make sure that and everyone on the team knows that if they have to activate an emergency operations center for the organization, they know what the primary service and support is. Because what I see happen all the time with organizations is they start to ask questions. What is our role during a pandemic? What is our role if a community we support evacuates, or the town or municipality or territory we're in evacuates? Should we be looking at, doing emergency social services? Should we be doing it, taking on more to help with the response? And chances are that the answer is no, because you still need to fulfill your strategic objectives, whatever those are. Whatever your strategy was days before the disaster is still your strategy during the disaster. But in order to complete that mandate within a very complex or chaotic environment, you have to sort of do what the body does, right? If I were to fall in freezing water, what happens? All the blood rushes to the core of my body, right? To keep my main organ system running. It's the same thing with an organization. If it's in chaos and it still has a mandate, resources from that organization need to collectively come together and only keep the main support areas functioning. And what that can mean, as an example, is what might be operations today for your facility, for your fleet, whatever it is, what it might be today is not going to be your operations during a disaster. And then there's a whole new communications environment and partner environment, meaning what you're communicating day to day is not going to be the same during a disaster or disruption than it was 2 days ago. You're not going to be putting out the same messages on social media. You're going to have to change your communications. Decision making is going to change because maybe your board members, if you have them, want different reporting and different information. So how do you get that up to them so they can make the decisions that the organization needs to fulfill its mandate during a disaster? So tying this back to the resilience assessment, we come up with a baseline of where you're at and what you're able to withstand with everything you have. And then we start to do some risk assessments, develop some scenarios, test those scenarios, ask some questions, and start building up the skills, knowledge, preparedness, resiliency of all your departments and teams across your organization. And this is going to start with things like alerting systems for your staff and team. Where are you going to get information on a major disruption? Or even how do you track what's called a slow burn risk, meaning things that don't necessarily come on suddenly, like federal policy changes, federal budget changes, changes within the ability to find caregivers in a community, right? There's a whole bunch of things that are going on around us that creep up really slowly. And if we're not monitoring those things and doing things to mitigate the consequences, then those risks turn into, medium and high risks, and they can start to impact our operations or ability to deliver the mandate. So you want that situational awareness piece in. Then you want to start looking at, what risks do you have? What exists, collecting the data for them, coming up with hazard specific plans to deal with those risks, going into continuity of operations and making sure that what services have to be fulfilled within, 12 hours, 24 hours, 72 hours, or 2 weeks, right? That can be done through a business impact analysis where for your organization, we design definitions of different levels of impact on, a legal aspect, a funding aspect, your strategic deliverables. If there's just a very minor impact, that can likely be handled by your current system. But if there's a catastrophic impact, that's where you need to incorporate service continuity, continuity of support, emergency management, coordination of the team to deal with that. Then there's the issue of responding, how to coordinate everything in a very chaotic environment. How do you set that up? Your communication channels, what partners do you work with? And then there's a transition into the recovery and what that looks like. And then having to learn from the response or the event that just happened. And how do you disseminate the knowledge gained, not only to your existing staff, but then for your other plans and your new onboarding and future staff that come in, so you're not starting at zero. So there's this process of having to kind of monitor your situation, respond, learn, and then implement and get better. And that's what we have on our Patreon, is where we dig more deep into our concept of operations and framework for this. We've got more tools, more support. So if you're not on our Patreon, head over there. And if you like this video, give it a like, subscribe to us so others like you can find this information. And please leave us a comment if you've got feedback. We'd really appreciate it.